proud of their work that they were accomplishing. But I also found this, and I thought it was very interesting, and the subtitle here is Slaughter of the Pines. And I feel like this is a very kind of fitting caption to this picture, because as we said before, 3 billion board feet were being taken out of Wisconsin at one time, so you can just imagine the amount of lumber that they were felling. Now after that lumber was felled, they would usually have to take it to the mill, because what good is it sitting out in the woods? They would use oxen, horses, sleds, and wagons to transport these logs. And another very dangerous part of the logging industry itself. Imagine transporting these with a sled, a horse, and often 5, maybe 6 logs high. So if you can imagine, we have a white pine log here. Imagine 5 or 6 of these high, and you'll get a better idea of where those men are on top of the log. And these guys were known as skybirds, because it was their job to sit on top and basically drive those horses through the woods. Definitely not a job I think I would have been applying for at the time, but these guys, once again, were willing to do it because they needed to support their families. And often the scene afterwards is a very desolate one, because they would take basically all they could. You can see in the background here, that obviously some of the forest is still there, but in the foreground, not much of a forest left anymore. Early artists depicted these skybirds as well. They were pretty popular. Now, after logs were felled themselves, you needed to keep track of whose logs were whose. So there were many different lumber companies out in the same kind of area along the Wisconsin River. But there were different businesses, and they needed different marks to keep their logs separate from other people's. So they would use stamping of the logs. So they would use a stamp and kind of hit it with a hammer in the butt end of a log, much like a cattle brand used to keep cattle apart from each other. So this would help them out once the logs would get to the mills. The people working at the mills would tally up how much each company brought in. Now I have an example up here you can come check out afterwards, but this is similar to what one of the brands would have looked like. So I'll pass this around. You can take a look at it. Now after the logs were felled, they were usually brought to one common area. All the logs, no matter what company, were brought to this certain area. Does anybody recognize where this area would be? Use the clues to maybe figure out what it is.
In the woods, river.
Probably near Wisconsin River. Yeah, it's actually the river. Now why would they put all their logs by the river? Easy way of transportation. Exactly. So once the ice and snow melts away, the logs just fall in the river by themselves. How much easier can it get? You know, you chop down the logs, bring them to the river, and then the river kind of does the rest of the work for you, right? So like a pretty easy job. Well, this was actually a place where many lives were lost. Once again, like we said, a very dangerous trade. These men worked in a siege of logs. So if you wouldn't know that this is actually a body of water, it could easily look like just a field or something full of logs. But this is truly, it's a lake actually, but a body of water full of wood. And one of the most dangerous places along the Wisconsin River actually happened to be Stevens Point and the Stevens Point Dam. Now here we are with I would say a small log jam. So in the springtime, when the ice and the snow would let loose, it was the job of people called raftsmen, or river pigs, to kind of prod these logs along gently. Now we have a pike pole over here. This was their tool of the trade. So these river pigs and raftsmen were given that pole to control this. Could you imagine? Now not only did they have a tough time, they had a pretty dangerous time. So if you can, close your eyes and try to imagine what it would be like to be a raftsman or a river pig during the 19th century. Now this is a story by Ceylon Childs Lincoln from 1868. Try to imagine yourself in his shoes. My first experience in rafting was 1868, when I went down with Homer Chase of Stevens Point as a pilot. Now first Being a sucker, I was unfortunately hired to make the trip on a flash trash fleet belonging to Walter McIndoe. The ice went out on the river April 17th, and the next day we started 5 men at each oar to run the Stevens Point Dam, near which the lumber had lain throughout the winter. The first trip for a sucker made his hair stand on end and brought to his mind all the misdeeds of his past life. We ran down the center of the river until within 20 rods of the dam. There, the current drew off to the right and came in between 2 piers about 30 feet apart. Between these piers was the slide, constructed of long logs called fingers, fastened with chains down to the dam. And on either side of the slide, the water dropped about 15 feet. Below the dam, the river boiled and rolled into whitecaps. If one was fortunate enough to make the slide properly, he could make his landing in the right place. Otherwise, there was a great danger of saddlebagging one of the piers and breaking to pieces. Sometimes the raft turned into a complete somersault, and the men who did not leap for the pier were drowned. Even when going over the slide, our rafts generally sank until we were standing waist deep in water, bumping along the rocks. So does that sound like a job that you would like to have? Once again, these men, it was their job to basically poke and prod these logs down the river with poles like the pipe. But I couldn't even imagine standing on one log and standing upright, not falling off. These men had to jump from logs to logs and poke them with the poles. Definitely not a job that I would look forward to. These logs were cut and actually brought down the river in a pretty rough timber form, and they were eventually held in booms to kind of contain them before they went into the mills themselves. Now, these river pigs, or raftsmen, they had a pretty tough job, obviously, you can tell by the story that we just read. How much do you think they were paid per day to do the job that they did? You think they were paid a pretty good wage for the time, not so great wage, pretty terrible wage? What do you think? You think bad? They were paid about $1.25 to $2 per day. Now this is in 1854. Now what do you think? Me telling you that.
That's pretty good.
Pretty good. Well, in modern day equivalents, that's actually making about $25 an hour, $25 to $30 an hour that these men were making. So obviously they're getting their money for sticking their neck out there and possibly drowning, being a river pig. So once these logs that were felled got to the mills themselves, they used pike poles and cant hooks and other things to get them into the mills themselves, in another interesting process. But once they got in the mills themselves, another man had to measure and see how many board feet you could actually get out of a certain log. Obviously, if you take the time to cut down a log as big as this by hand, you want to get as much wood and as much lumber out of it as possible. So it's this man's job to do this. Now, what's interesting is actually a lot of children worked in the mills during this time, doing the same jobs alongside brothers, fathers, cousins. But they were working with machinery, saws, conveyor belts, things that were dangerous once again. But they were happy to do it because they were also paid and helping to support the family. But there was definitely children in an adult's world, is what I think. An interesting fact is a lot of the saws and different machinery that were in the mills themselves were actually ran by the Wisconsin River. There was an interesting quote I found along the way that said one of the saws was ran by 125 horsepower of the old Wisconsin's unlimited supply. And I thought that really captured this well, the hydropower, or the water, using to turn these saws themselves. But once again, kind of a grueling job. Long days, repetitive tasks, like we were talking about before, sharp blades, saws, conveyor belts, things you had to deal with on a day-to-day end. But it was good work, and the lumber industry at this time was really booming. and they were happy to do it because it could support their family. Now this new opportunities, this logging industry that was coming around, also kind of came back and helped Stevens Point develop as a city. Because these lumbermen had come in, they obviously had demands for things. So general stores came, banks, other businesses that really needed to support the needs of these new loggers. So as before, we were talking a population in 1850, it was 200 people. In the next decade, it doubled to about 450. By that next decade, it had tripled. Now, I'm not really sure what exactly happened in 1870 and 1880. It didn't increase that much. But if you look at the coming decades, it goes to 4,000 and then doubles again to about 9,000. So in a 50-year time period, Stevens Point as a city grew over 9,300 people. And this was mainly because of the logging industry. Now some of the places constructed during this time are places that you and I probably recognize today. They still stand because of the materials that they built them out of. Very strong and durable. So some of these places you may recognize still today. Obviously it's changed a little bit, but not too much from what these loggers had once known. Now this one is interesting. This is actually the Liberty pole, they called it. And it was cut out of one single log of white pine, and it was their old flagpole in kind of their market central or market square of the time. And this is where a lot of the Stevens Point residents would gather for celebrations and different things like that. So the Stevens Point Liberty pole, no longer standing obviously. Some other businesses you may know from downtown. The J.O. Johnson building is at the northwest corner. It's still standing today. At the southwest corner was the C. Krem's Brother Hardware Company. A little bit different, but still standing. So as you can tell, the downtown area was really built down during this time of the loggers, for the loggers and their needs. An interesting book that I also found while researching the subject was Along the Wisconsin River. It was written in 1907 by A. Decker, and it really describes a lot of the towns, villages, and businesses that sprung up along the Wisconsin River because of really the logging industry and the needs of those loggers. Some of the companies that's highlighted in Wisconsin, or excuse me, in Stevens Point in general, was the John Week Lumber Company and the Clifford Lumber Company. Now between these two lumber companies alone, they actually employed over 400 people alone. Now that's people out in the woods, people in the mills, but 400 people out of a population of possibly 4,500, that's a pretty big industry. Some other interesting places, the Taylor Brothers Drug Company, which is now Arbuckles, also built during that time. Some other interesting businesses that sprung up during this period. My favorites probably are the Reversible Tire Protector Company, Ringness the Shoe Man, and Wisconsin's Best Laundry Company. That one maybe was the tagline that didn't make it when they picked Gateway for the Pineries, but I would have liked Stevens Point, Wisconsin's Best Laundry. Some other names you might be familiar with is E.J. Piffner. Does everybody know that name? How it relates to Stevens Point? Piffner Park. He was actually a very prominent lumberman during this time. He started out working out in the woods, felling the trees, but eventually owned his own milling and planing company later on in the time. Another important person, August Gerke. Does anybody recognize Gerke Field? So where the Pointers and Spash play. Gerke was actually a tailor, and he was quoted as being a very loyal Stevens Point man. And any kind of research that I brought up on him